The escape pod screamed through the void, its hull glowing cherry red as atmospheric processors failed one by one. Commander Zara Chun pressed her palm against the cracked view screen, watching the debris field of what had once been the UES determination spread like a metallic constellation behind her. 2,300 souls aboard that ship, and she was the only one who made it to the pods before the reactor breach. Her breathing came in short gasps, not from fear but from the slowly depleting oxygen reserves. The pod's life support had taken damage during the explosion, and, according to the flickering display, she had maybe 6 hours of breathable air left. The nearest human colony was 14 hours away at maximum burn, and the pod's engines were already operating beyond safe parameters. She had accepted her fate 3 hours ago when the calculations became undeniable. Death was coming for her, just as it had come for her crew. The only question was whether she would suffocate first or freeze when the heating elements finally gave out. The proximity alarm chimed weakly, its tone distorted by damaged circuits. Zara's head snapped up from where she had been composing her final message home. Through the static-filled display, she could see a massive shape approaching. Her heart hammered against her ribs as recognition dawned. It was a Crovaxi battlecruiser. The ship was enormous, easily 3 kilometers from bow to stern, its dark hull covered in the organic-looking curves that marked it as one of the apex predator species that ruled this sector of space. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along its flanks like a slow heartbeat, and weapon ports gaped like hungry mouths along its sides. Zara had fought the Crovaxi before. Everyone in the Terran Navy had, at one point or another. They were relentless, methodical, and utterly without mercy. Their empire had swallowed 17 species in the past century, turning their worlds into breeding grounds for the Crovaxi's endless swarms. Humans had managed to hold them off for nearly a decade, but barely. The battlecruiser's tractor beam seized her pod with casual ease, drawing it toward one of the smaller docking bays. Zara checked her sidearm, a plasma pistol with enough charge for maybe 12 shots, and laughed bitterly at the gesture. What was she going to do? Shoot her way through a ship crewed by thousands of 2-meter-tall apex predators? Still, she kept the weapon in her hand as the pod was drawn into the alien vessel's belly. The docking bay was vast and dimly lit, filled with a sickly green atmosphere that looked toxic to human lungs. Through the pod's small porthole, Zara could see movement in the shadows, tall, angular shapes that moved with predatory grace. The Crovaxi in their natural environment. The pod settled onto a docking cradle with a metallic clang, and Zara heard the hiss of atmospheric processors attempting to equalize pressure. Her suit's environment readings flashed warnings about the alien atmosphere, high in methane and sulfur compounds, definitely lethal to human physiology. A shadow fell across the porthole, and Zara found herself looking up at her first Crovaxi in person. The being was even more intimidating than the intelligence briefings had suggested. Nearly 2.5 meters tall, with a lean, muscular build that spoke of evolutionary optimization for combat. Its skin was a deep gray-green, marked with darker stripes that seemed to shift in the alien lighting. The head was elongated, almost serpentine, with large, multifaceted eyes that gleamed with cold intelligence. For arms extended from its torso, each ending in hands tipped with retractable claws that could slice through steel. But it was the creature's bearing that truly unsettled her. There was no emotion in its stance, no curiosity or malice. It regarded her with the same detachment a human might show when examining an interesting insect. The airlock cycled, and Zara felt her suit automatically seal itself as the pod's atmosphere was replaced by the ship's toxic environment. The Crovaxi stepped inside, moving with fluid grace despite its size. When it spoke, its words came through her suit's translation system in a voice like grinding metal. Human female, you are designated as combat personnel based on uniform and equipment analysis. It was not a question. Zara raised her chin defiantly, though she knew the gesture was probably meaningless to the alien. Commander Zara Chun, United Earth Ship Determination. Service number 779-, irrelevant. The Crovaxi's secondary arms moved to a device attached to its belt, some kind of scanner. Your vessel was destroyed in the engagement 14 hours ago. You are the sole survivor detected. Zara blinked. 14 hours? She had been unconscious longer than she thought. What engagement? We were on a diplomatic mission to the Centauri colonies. The Crovaxi's primary eyes focused on her with unsettling intensity. Your species' diplomatic mission was a facade. The vessel carried military-grade weaponry and shield generators far exceeding peaceful specifications. It was classified as a threat and eliminated. The words hit Zara like a physical blow. The determination had been armed, yes, but only with standard defensive systems. Unless Command had been planning something they hadn't told the crew about. Unless this whole diplomatic mission had been cover for something else entirely. That's impossible, she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she remembered the sealed orders Captain Morrison had received before departure. The way he had looked afterward, grim and troubled. The additional security teams that had come aboard at the last minute. Your species has proven adept at deception, the Crovaxi continued, its tone never changing from that flat, emotionless cadence. This is the 7th Terran vessel intercepted carrying concealed military assets while claiming peaceful intent. 7th? Zara's mind reeled. She had heard reports of ships going missing, but Command had always blamed pirates or navigation errors. If the Crovaxi were telling the truth. However, the alien continued, and something in its tone made Zara's blood chill. Your capture presents an opportunity for information gathering. You will be taken to the interrogation chambers for processing. Zara had heard stories about Crovaxi interrogation techniques. They involved neural probes that could extract memories directly from a subject's brain, a process that left the victim's mind completely shattered. She would tell them everything, not just what she knew, but everything she had ever known. Every secret, every tactical doctrine, every piece of intelligence about human defenses and capabilities. And then, they would discard what remained of her consciousness like garbage. She looked down at the plasma pistol in her hand. One shot to the head would be faster than whatever they had planned for her. Cleaner. She had heard that Crovaxi often kept their victims alive for days during the process, extracting memories in small doses to preserve the neural pathways as long as possible. The alien seemed to follow her train of thought with disturbing ease. Suicide is not recommended. The interrogation process can be extended significantly if initial neural patterns are disrupted by trauma. Zara's finger tightened on the trigger. At least this way, she would die human. Commander Chun. The voice came from behind the Crovaxi, speaking in accented but clear English. Zara's eyes widened as another figure stepped into view, a human figure. The man was tall and lean, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair and pale skin that suggested he had spent most of his life in artificial light. He wore what looked like a modified Crovaxi uniform, but in human proportions. Most shocking of all, he moved freely, without restraints or guards. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb," the human said, stepping forward until he stood beside the towering alien. "I'm sorry about your ship, Commander. I tried to convince them to disable rather than destroy, but the Crovaxi don't take chances with what they perceive as threats." Zara's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. You're working with them?" Webb's expression was carefully neutral. "It's complicated. May I suggest we continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable? Your suit's life support is probably running low after your time in the pod." The Crovaxi made a sound that might have been agreement. "The human will be transferred to Specialist Webb's custody, pending interrogation schedule availability. Standard containment protocols apply." "Of course," Webb said with what sounded like practiced patience. "Thank you, War Commander Thektar." The alien turned without another word and glided out of the pod, leaving Zara alone with the human collaborator. Webb watched the Crovaxi leave, then turned back to her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly, "and you're not entirely wrong. But things are not what they seem here, Commander. If you want to live long enough to understand what's really happening, I suggest you come with me." Zara kept her weapon trained on him. "Why should I trust you? You're working for the enemy." Webb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face. "Because," he said finally, "I'm the only reason you're still breathing. That war commander wanted to space you immediately after scanning your pod. I convinced him you might have intelligence value." "And why would you do that?" A strange smile crossed Webb's features. "Because I've been waiting for someone like you, Commander. Someone with the clearance and experience to understand what I'm about to show you. Someone who might actually be able to do something about it. He gestured toward the pod's exit. Your choice. Come with me and learn why your species is about to face extinction, or stay here and wait for the interrogation teams. But decide quickly, my influence with the Crovaxi has limits, and that time is running out. Zara looked at the plasma pistol in her hands, then at the human who claimed to be offering her salvation. Everything about the situation felt wrong, but Webb was right about one thing. She was out of options. And if there was even a chance he was telling the truth about some larger threat to humanity, she had to investigate. Slowly, she lowered her weapon. Webb nodded approvingly. Smart choice. Follow me, and try to look defeated. The Crovaxi expect humans to be broken by capture, and we don't want to disappoint them. As they walked through the alien ship's corridors, Zara tried to process everything she had learned. The Determination's true mission, the other ships that had been destroyed, the existence of a human working freely among humanity's enemies. It all painted a picture of a conflict far more complex than anything she had been told. The corridors were dimly lit and filled with that same toxic atmosphere, but Webb moved through them with obvious familiarity. They passed groups of Crovaxi warriors who barely glanced at the humans, as if seeing Webb escort prisoners was a common occurrence. How long have you been here? Zara asked quietly. Almost 2 years, Webb replied without turning around. I was chief xenobiologist aboard the UES Marathon when we encountered the Crovaxi. My entire team was killed, but they decided my knowledge of human physiology was valuable enough to keep me alive. And you just cooperated? Webb stopped at an intersection, pressing his palm against some kind of biometric scanner. A door slid open, revealing what looked like human-compatible quarters beyond. I did what I had to do to survive, just like you're doing now. The room was spartanly furnished, but clearly designed for human comfort. The atmosphere was breathable, the lighting was in the visible spectrum, and the gravity felt close to Earth normal. Webb sealed the door behind them and activated some kind of privacy field that made the air shimmer slightly. Now we can speak freely, he said, his entire demeanor changing. The defeated, cooperative prisoner persona disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated focused intensity. The Crovaxi monitoring systems can't penetrate this field, one of the few advantages of being their pet scientist. Zara holstered her pistol but remained ready to draw it again. Pet scientist. They keep me around because I understand human biology better than their own xenobiologists do. It makes their interrogation techniques more effective. Webb's expression darkened. I've helped them extract information from 43 human prisoners over the past 2 years, Commander. 43 good people who died screaming while I optimized the neural probe settings. The confession hit Zara like a physical blow. You monster. Yes, Webb said simply. I am. But I'm also the only hope your species has left. He moved to a wall panel and activated a holographic display that filled half the room with swirling star charts and tactical data. What I'm about to show you is classified at levels that probably don't exist in human military doctrine. This information cost me my soul to acquire, and it's going to cost you everything you thought you knew about this war. The display shifted, showing the local sector of space in three-dimensional detail. Red markers indicated Crovaxi territory, blue showed human space, and various other colors represented the dozen minor species caught between the two major powers. The Crovaxi aren't just another predator species expanding their territory, Webb began, his voice taking on the cadence of a lecturer. They're a weapon, Commander. A weapon created by something far worse. He manipulated the display, zooming out to show a broader view of the galaxy. 3 million years ago, there was a galactic civilization that made the Crovaxi Empire look like children playing with toys. They were called the Architects, and they ruled over 1,000 species across 50,000 star systems. New markers appeared on the display. Ancient ruins, dead worlds, artifacts that radiated an almost tangible sense of menace even through the holographic interface. The Architects were perfectionists, Webb continued. They believed that biological evolution was inefficient, chaotic, so they decided to guide it. They created dozens of species like the Crovaxi, apex predators designed to consume and subjugate other civilizations, growing stronger with each conquest. Zara stared at the display, trying to process the implications. You're saying the Crovaxi are artificial? Genetically modified, yes. Enhanced beyond anything natural selection could produce. But here's the crucial part. They were never meant to be the end product. They were meant to be the test. The display shifted again, showing a timeline that stretched back millions of years. Zara could see the rise and fall of civilizations, the spread of architect influence, and, finally, darkness. What happened to these architects? Webb's smile was grim. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The species they created were so effective at what they did that they eventually turned on their creators. The Crovaxi were one of the few to survive the resulting chaos, and they've spent the last million years believing they won their freedom through their own strength. But they didn't. No, they were allowed to survive because they serve a purpose. They're still following their original programming, even though they don't know it. Every species they conquer, every world they assimilate, it all feeds into a larger pattern. Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's atmosphere. What pattern? Webb manipulated the display one final time, showing the current state of the galaxy. The Crovaxi Empire sprawled across thousands of systems, connected by strange geometric patterns that seemed almost organic. The architects aren't dead, Commander. They're sleeping. And every conquest the Crovaxi make brings us closer to waking them up. The implications hit Zara like a cascading series of explosions. If Webb was telling the truth, and the evidence he was showing certainly looked convincing, then humanity wasn't just fighting for survival against the Crovaxi. They were fighting to prevent the resurrection of something that had once ruled the entire galaxy. How do you know all this? She asked. Webb's expression became haunted. Because I've been inside their database, Commander. The Crovaxi keep records of everything. Genetic templates, conquered species, even fragments of architect technology they've recovered but don't understand. Over 2 years, I've been able to piece together the truth. And what exactly am I supposed to do with this information? Help me steal it, Webb said simply. All of it. Every piece of data the Crovaxi have collected, every fragment of architect technology, every genetic template, and strategic plan. And then, help me get it back to Earth before it's too late. Zara stared at him. That's impossible. You're talking about infiltrating the most secure systems on a ship filled with thousands of hostile aliens. Actually, Webb said, his expression shifting to something that might have been hope. I'm talking about infiltrating something much bigger than that. He gestured to the walls around them. This isn't just a battlecruiser, Commander. It's a mobile archive ship, one of only 3 in the Crovaxi fleet. We're sitting on top of the largest collection of strategic intelligence in the known galaxy. Even if we could somehow access it, how would we escape? My pod is destroyed, and I assume you don't have a ship hidden somewhere. Webb's smile became genuinely enthusiastic for the first time since they had met. That's where your timing becomes perfect, Commander. In 72 hours, this ship will dock at the Crovaxi capital world for a strategic conference. Every high-ranking military leader in their empire will be aboard, along with their most sensitive data cores. And that's when we're going to steal their entire civilization's worth of intelligence and escape in the chaos that follows. Zara sat down heavily in the room's single chair, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. This is insane. Yes, Webb agreed. But it's also the only chance humanity has. Because if we don't stop what's coming, the Crovaxi are going to complete their programming. And when they do, something far worse than any conquest fleet is going to wake up. Through the room's small porthole, Zara could see stars wheeling slowly past as the battlecruiser continued its journey toward the Crovaxi capital. Somewhere out there, humanity's colonies and Earth itself continued their daily existence, unaware that their entire species balanced on the edge of extinction. She thought about Captain Morrison and the sealed orders that had doomed her ship, about the 2,300 crew members who had died believing they were on a diplomatic mission, about the 7 other ships Webb claimed had been destroyed while carrying hidden military assets. There's something else, she said slowly. Something about my ship's mission that doesn't add up. The Crovaxi said we were carrying concealed weapons, but that doesn't match what I saw in our cargo manifest. Webb nodded grimly. Your command has been feeding ships to the Crovaxi for months, Commander. probably trying to gather intelligence on their capabilities or possibly attempting to get someone into their fleet structure. Someone like me. Someone like you. Though I doubt they expected their operative to end up on an archive ship with access to the information we've found. Webb's expression became calculating, which raises an interesting question. What exactly were you carrying in those sealed cargo holds? Zara closed her eyes, trying to remember everything she could about the Determination's final mission. The additional security teams, the modifications to their communication systems, the way Captain Morrison had seemed increasingly nervous as they approached their destination. I think, she said slowly, we need to talk about what my people might have been planning, and whether it changes our chances of survival. Webb leaned forward intently. What do you mean? I mean that if Earth Command was willing to sacrifice 7 ships and thousands of crew members to get intelligence on the Crovaxi, they might have given us something more than just concealed weapons. She met his eyes. They might have given us a way to contact them. For the first time since she had been captured, Zara began to think they might actually have a chance. But, as she looked at the strategic displays still glowing around them, showing the vast scope of the threat they faced, she wondered if even Earth's most desperate contingency plans would be enough to stop what was coming. Outside the porthole, the stars continued their ancient dance, unaware that the fate of every thinking being in the galaxy might soon be decided aboard a single alien ship traveling through the endless dark. The gravity generators hummed differently as the Crovaxi archive ship approached their destination. Zara had been aboard for 3 days now, and she was beginning to understand the subtle rhythms of the alien vessel. The shift in the hum meant they were dropping out of hyperspace, which meant they had less than 12 hours before reaching the Crovaxi capital world. She sat cross-legged on the floor of Webb's quarters, surrounded by holographic displays showing the internal layout of the ship. Over the past 72 hours, the xenobiologist had proven to be a meticulous planner and surprisingly capable teacher. He had mapped every corridor, every security checkpoint, every potential route to the central data cores. The primary archive is here, Webb said, highlighting a section deep in the ship's core. 17 levels down from our current position, protected by quantum encryption fields and guarded by the elite Crovaxi security forces. Getting there undetected will be impossible. So we don't go undetected, Zara replied, studying the schematic. We create a distraction big enough to draw security away from the archives. Webb shook his head. You're thinking like a human military officer, Commander. The Crovaxi don't respond to diversions the way we do. Their security protocols are designed around the concept of acceptable losses. They would let half the ship burn if it meant protecting their data cores. Zara frowned, trying to understand the alien mindset. Then how do we get access? We don't break in, Webb said, manipulating the display to show a different route. We get invited. The new path led through medical sections and laboratory complexes, areas Zara recognized from her brief tours of the ship. You want to use your position as their pet scientist. Exactly. In 6 hours, I have a scheduled consultation with the archive keepers. They want my analysis of some human genetic samples they've recovered from recent battles. It's routine work, but it requires direct interface with the primary data cores. And you think you can download their entire database during a routine consultation? Webb's expression became grim. Not download, Commander. Copy. There's a difference. He called up another display, this one showing what looked like complex molecular structures. Remember what I told you about the architect technology? The Crovaxi have been collecting fragments for millennia without understanding what they've found. But I do understand it, at least partially. The molecular structures rotated slowly, revealing intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change even as Zara watched them. There was something unsettling about the designs, as if they were too complex for biological matter to maintain naturally. These are quantum storage matrices, Webb explained. Architect technology for storing vast amounts of information in what appears to be ordinary biological tissue. Each matrix can hold roughly the equivalent of a small planet's worth of data. Zara stared at the displays. You're saying the architects used living tissue as computer storage? More than that. They integrated it into their own biology. Every architect was essentially a walking library containing the accumulated knowledge of their entire civilization. Webb's voice dropped to a whisper. And the Crovaxi have been collecting these matrices for 1 million years, completely unaware of what they represent. The implications began to dawn on Zara. When you said the architects were sleeping, I meant it literally. Their consciousness, their memories, their knowledge, everything that made them who they were is stored in those matrices, waiting for the right conditions to reactivate. And what are the right conditions? Webb manipulated the display again, showing the current distribution of Crovaxi forces across the galaxy. Critical mass. When the Crovaxi have conquered enough species and accumulated enough genetic diversity, the matrices will have everything they need to resurrect their creators. How much is enough? Based on my calculations, approximately 100 species with complete genetic profiles and behavioral data. The Crovaxi currently have samples from 97 different civilizations. Zara felt her blood turn cold. And humans would make 98. If they managed to complete their conquest, yes. But there's something else, Commander. Something that might give us an advantage. Webb called up a new set of data, this time showing what appeared to be genetic analysis charts. Remember those sealed orders your ship was carrying? The ones that led to the determination being classified as a military threat. What about them? I've been thinking about what you said regarding your command's willingness to sacrifice ships and crews for intelligence. That level of desperation suggests they knew more about the threat than they were telling their own people. Zara nodded slowly. The additional security teams, the communication modifications, they were preparing for something specific. More than that, Webb said, highlighting specific genetic markers on the charts. I think they were preparing for this. Look at these readings. The genetic data meant nothing to Zara, but Webb's excitement was unmistakable. What am I looking at? Quantum genetic modifications. Subtle alterations to human DNA that would be almost impossible to detect without specialized equipment. Your entire crew was carrying modified genetic markers, Commander. Modified how? Webb's smile was predatory. Modified to make you incompatible with architect resurrection protocols. Your command somehow learned about the matrices and engineered a genetic poison pill. If the Crovaxi tried to use human genetic data to complete their collection, it would corrupt the entire system. Zara stared at the data, trying to process what she was hearing. You're saying my crew was turned into walking biological weapons? Exactly. And the best part is, the Crovaxi don't know. They've been collecting samples from your people for months, completely unaware that every human they capture brings them closer to permanently damaging their precious archives. But that would also prevent us from accessing the data. Not necessarily, Webb said, calling up yet another display. The modifications only activate during large-scale genetic integration processes. Smaller, localized access attempts would be unaffected. We could copy the data without triggering the safeguards. Zara stood up and began pacing the small room, her mind racing through the possibilities. So our plan is to access the archives, copy everything we can, and hope that when the Crovaxi eventually try to use human genetic data, it destroys their entire system? That's part of it. But there's something else we need to do first. Webb's expression became deadly serious. We need to accelerate the timeline. What do you mean? I mean, we don't wait for the Crovaxi to naturally discover human genetic incompatibility. We force them to discover it now, while we're still aboard this ship. Zara stopped pacing. That sounds like suicide. It would be, if we were planning to stay aboard. But, remember, in 8 hours this ship docks at the Crovaxi capital. Every senior military leader in their empire will be in one location, along with their primary archive ships. And Webb's smile became genuinely frightening. And that's when we trigger a system-wide cascade failure that destroys every architect matrix in the Crovaxi fleet simultaneously. The scope of what he was proposing hit Zara like a physical blow. You want to destroy their entire civilization's worth of accumulated knowledge. I want to prevent the resurrection of something that could destroy every civilization in the galaxy, Webb corrected. The matrices aren't just storage devices, Commander. They're eggs, waiting to hatch. He showed her one final display, a projection of what would happen if the architect consciousness was successfully reactivated. The simulation showed vast fleets of ships unlike anything in known space, weapons that could extinguish stars, and, most terrifying of all, the systematic conversion of every inhabited world into something that barely resembled life as they knew it. The architects didn't just rule the galaxy, Webb said quietly. They remade it in their image. Every planet they controlled was turned into a massive biological computer, with the inhabitants serving as processing units in a galactic consciousness that spanned light years. Zara sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were facing. How do we even begin to fight something like that? We don't fight it, Webb said. We prevent it from ever existing. And we use the Crovaxi's own obsession with genetic perfection against them. A soft chime echoed through the room, and Webb immediately began shutting down the holographic displays. That's the signal for my consultation appointment. Are you ready for this, Commander? Zara checked her stolen Crovaxi environmental suit one final time. Webb had managed to acquire it from the ship's storage areas, along with identity documents that would hopefully pass casual inspection. She would be posing as his research assistant, a role that would give her access to the archive areas without raising suspicion. As ready as I can be. What's our extraction plan if this goes wrong? Webb's expression became grim. If this goes wrong, Commander, extraction becomes irrelevant. If we fail here, humanity has perhaps 6 months before the Crovaxi complete their conquest. And after that, everything we've ever known ceases to exist. Exactly. They made their way through the ship's corridors in silence, passing groups of Crovaxi warriors who barely acknowledged their presence. Webb had been right about one thing. His position as a valued specialist gave him considerable freedom of movement within the vessel. The archive levels were noticeably different from the rest of the ship. The corridors were wider and more brightly lit, with what appeared to be organic components integrated into the walls themselves. Zara could feel a subtle vibration through the deck plating, as if they were walking through the interior of some vast living creature. Quantum matrices, Webb whispered in response to her questioning look. The storage systems are partially biological. That's why they require such specialized environmental controls. They reached the main archive chamber after passing through 3 separate security checkpoints. Each time, Webb's credentials were scanned and accepted without question, though Zara noticed that the guards seemed more alert than those in other parts of the ship. The chamber itself was unlike anything she had ever seen. The walls curved upward into a dome that disappeared into darkness above their heads. Thousands of cylindrical containers lined the walls, each one glowing with a soft, pulsing light that reminded her uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Each container holds the complete genetic and cultural data from a conquered species, Webb explained as they approached a central console. 97 civilizations, reduced to patterns of light, and stored like specimens in a museum. The console was clearly designed for Crovaxi operators, but Webb moved through the interface with practiced ease. I've been studying this system for 2 years, he said in response to Zara's surprised expression. The Crovaxi may be apex predators, but they're surprisingly predictable in their technological approaches. Data began flowing across the console's displays. Vast streams of information that seemed to represent the accumulated knowledge of entire worlds. Zara found herself looking at star charts, genetic templates, cultural analyses, and military tactical doctrine from species she had never heard of. This is incredible, she breathed. And terrible, Webb added grimly. Each data stream represents billions of lives. Civilizations that existed for thousands of years before the Crovaxi found them. He began inputting new commands into the console, his movements becoming more urgent. I'm accessing the human data cores now. If your command's genetic modifications are going to work, we should see evidence of incompatibility when I try to integrate the samples with the matrix network. The displays changed, showing complex genetic models that meant nothing to Zara but seemed to fascinate Webb. Interesting, he murmured. The integration protocols are accepting human genetic data without any obvious problems. Is that bad? Not necessarily. The modifications might be designed to activate only during final integration, when the matrices attempt to resurrect the architect consciousness. He paused, studying the data more closely. But there's something else here. Something unexpected. A new set of displays appeared, showing what looked like quantum mechanical equations mixed with biological processes she couldn't begin to understand. But Webb's expression had shifted from concentration to amazement. Commander, he said slowly, your command didn't just create a poison pill for the architect matrices. What do you mean? Webb's hands moved across the console with increasing speed, calling up deeper and deeper levels of data. The genetic modifications in your crew, they're not just incompatible with architect resurrection protocols. They're designed to overwrite them. Overwrite them how? By replacing the architect consciousness template with something else entirely. Your people didn't just create a way to destroy the matrices. They created a way to reprogram them. The implications hit Zara like a thunderbolt. They wanted to steal the architect technology. More than steal it, Webb said, his voice filled with growing excitement and horror. They wanted to replace it. To turn the most powerful technology in galactic history into a weapon for human expansion. Before Zara could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the archive chamber. Security lights flashed, and she could hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from multiple directions. "We've been detected," Webb said, his hands flying across the console as he tried to complete whatever process he had started. The system must have triggered automatic security protocols when it detected the human genetic modifications. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 2 minutes before they reach us." "But, Commander," he turned to face her, his expression desperate. "I can complete the transfer. I can download everything in the matrices and trigger the cascade failure that will prevent the architects from ever being resurrected. But, if I do, we'll never make it out of this chamber alive." Zara could hear the Crovaxi security forces getting closer, their alien voices echoing through the corridors in what sounded like tactical communications. Soon they would be surrounded, with no hope of escape. She thought about her crew, dead in the cold vacuum around their destroyed ship. About the 97 civilizations whose entire existence had been reduced to data storage in these chambers. About the sleeping consciousness of the architects, waiting to wake up and remake the galaxy in their image. And she thought about humanity, which had apparently been willing to play with forces beyond their understanding in a desperate attempt to gain advantage over their enemies. "Do it," she said. Webb nodded and turned back to the console. His hands moved with desperate precision as massive amounts of data began flowing through the ship's quantum networks. The storage containers around the chamber began pulsing more rapidly, their lights shifting from soft blue to angry red. "The cascade is beginning," Webb said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chamber's cool temperature. "Once it reaches critical mass, every matrix in the Crovaxi fleet will be corrupted simultaneously. The architect consciousness will be permanently destroyed. And us. The energy release will probably vaporize this entire section of the ship." The chamber doors burst open, and Crovaxi security forces poured in from 3 different entrances. They moved with terrifying efficiency, their weapons trained on the 2 humans at the central console. War Commander Thektar strode into the chamber behind his troops, his multifaceted eyes blazing with cold fury. "Step away from the console, humans. Your interference has been detected and cataloged." Webb's hands never stopped moving across the controls. 60 seconds until Cascade reaches critical mass," he said quietly to Zara. "The process can't be stopped now. You will cease your activities immediately," Thektar commanded, raising what looked like some kind of neural disruptor weapon. "The archives contain irreplaceable data essential to Crovaxi's strategic objectives." "That's exactly why we're destroying them," Zara replied, drawing her plasma pistol. She knew it was useless against so many opponents, but she wasn't going to die passively. Something changed in Thektar's expression, a flicker of what might have been uncertainty. "You do not understand the significance of what you are attempting to destroy. The knowledge contained in these matrices represents the accumulated wisdom of 100 civilizations. And the sleeping consciousness of their conquerors," Webb added without looking up from the console. 30 seconds until critical mass. "The architect matrices are not weapons," Thektar said. And for the first time since Zara had met him, the alien sounded almost desperate. "They are repositories of knowledge that will allow our species to transcend our biological limitations." Zara stared at the war commander in shock. You know what they really are." "Of course we know," Thektar replied. "The Crovaxi have spent 1,000,000 years preparing for the Great Awakening. When the architects return, they will guide our evolution into something greater than mere predators." "They'll turn you into slaves," Webb said, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining his work at the console. "Just like they did to every other species they encountered. They will turn us into perfection itself." A singular consciousness spanning the entire galaxy, free from the chaos and inefficiency of individual thought. 20 seconds, Webb announced. Zara looked around the chamber at the storage containers, at the alien soldiers who believed they were moments away from achieving some kind of transcendence, at the human who had spent 2 years preparing for this moment. And she made a decision that surprised even her. Webb, stop. The xenobiologist's hands froze over the console. Commander, I said stop the process. Zara, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. She kept her weapon trained on the Crovaxi, but her voice was calm and clear. We're not going to destroy the archives. War Commander Thektar made a sound that might have been relief, but Zara wasn't finished. We're going to steal them instead. The silence in the archive chamber stretched for what felt like an eternity. Webb's hands remained frozen over the console. The cascade process halted mere seconds before critical mass. War Commander Thektar and his security forces maintained their positions, weapons trained on the 2 humans, but something in the alien's posture suggested uncertainty. Explain your proposal, Thektar said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to understand an incomprehensible tactical situation. Zara kept her plasma pistol ready, though she knew it would be useless if the Crovaxi decided to open fire. Dr. Webb, what would happen if we completed the data transfer without triggering the cascade failure? Webb's eyes were wide with confusion and perhaps a hint of fear. Commander, if we don't destroy the matrices, the architect consciousness will eventually answer the question. Webb looked between Zara and the surrounding aliens, clearly trying to understand what game she was playing. If we complete the transfer without the cascade, we would have a complete copy of all the matrix data, but the originals would remain intact. Including the architect consciousness templates? Yes, but, and would our copy include the human genetic modifications that my command inserted into the system? Understanding began to dawn in Webb's eyes. Yes, the modifications would be part of the copy data structure. Zara turned to face Thektar directly, noting the way the alien's secondary arms had shifted position slightly, a sign of increased attention, according to the intelligence briefings she had studied years ago. War Commander, you said your species has spent 1,000,000 years preparing for what you call the Great Awakening. But what if I told you that the awakening you're expecting isn't the one you're going to get? Thektar's multifaceted eyes focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. Explain. The human genetic data your forces have been collecting isn't just another conquered species for your archives. It's been specifically modified to alter the architect resurrection protocols. When your matrices attempt to awaken the architect consciousness, they won't be getting ancient galactic overlords. What would they be getting? The question came from one of the other Crovaxi in the chamber, a smaller individual whose uniform markings suggested a technical specialist rather than a warrior. Webb had caught on to Zara's strategy and picked up the explanation. They would be getting human consciousness templates overlaid onto architect technological capabilities. In essence, the resurrection process would create hybrid entities with human psychology and architect power levels. That is impossible, Thektar stated flatly. The genetic integration protocols are designed to preserve the original consciousness patterns. Under normal circumstances, yes, Zara agreed. But my command apparently spent considerable resources developing countermeasures specifically designed to subvert those protocols. The question is, what do we do with that information? She lowered her weapon slightly, though not enough to be considered a gesture of surrender. You can kill us now and proceed with your planned awakening, knowing that you're going to get something very different from what you expect. Or you can work with us to understand exactly what you're dealing with. Why would you assist us? Thektar asked. Your species and ours are at war. Because, Zara said, my species apparently decided to play with forces beyond our understanding without considering the consequences. If human-modified architect consciousness emerges with the technological capabilities you've been describing, it won't just threaten the Crovaxi Empire. It will threaten everyone. The war commander was quiet for a long moment, his primary eyes studying Zara while his secondary eyes remained focused on Webb and the console. You are proposing a temporary alliance. I'm proposing that we figure out what's really in those matrices before anyone makes irreversible decisions. Webb looked between the two of them with growing alarm. Commander, you're suggesting we cooperate with the enemy to analyze technology that could reshape the entire galaxy. The risks are exceeded by the risks of acting without understanding what we're dealing with. Zara cut him off. Dr. Webb, in your 2 years aboard this ship, have you ever successfully analyzed the deeper levels of the Matrix data? No. The quantum encryption systems are too complex for my equipment to penetrate. War Commander, have your specialists been able to fully decode the architect consciousness templates? Our understanding remains incomplete, Thektar admitted reluctantly. Then, we're all working with partial information, which means any decision we make, whether it's awakening the consciousness, destroying it, or allowing the modified human data to corrupt it, could have consequences none of us can predict. Zara holstered her weapon completely, a gesture that caused visible tension among the Crovaxi security forces. But if we pool our resources and knowledge, we might actually understand what we're dealing with before we commit to a course of action. The technical specialist who had spoken earlier stepped forward. War Commander, the human's logic has merit. Our analysis teams have been attempting to decode the consciousness templates for decades without success. Access to human computational methods might provide new insights. Thektar's gaze shifted to the specialist. Subcommander Vekhai, you believe cooperation with these humans would advance our strategic objectives? I believe the risks of proceeding without complete understanding exceed the risks of temporary cooperation, Vekhai replied, unconsciously echoing Zara's earlier words. And if the humans attempt to sabotage our operations during this cooperation? Vekhai made a gesture that Zara couldn't interpret, but that seemed to amuse Thektar. They would be aboard a Crovaxi battlecruiser, surrounded by thousands of our warriors, with no means of escape or communication with their own forces. Their capacity for sabotage would be limited. Webb stepped away from the console, his hands visible and empty. Commander Chen, are you sure about this? We're talking about giving the Crovaxi access to human analytical capabilities. Dr. Webb, we're talking about preventing a disaster that could affect every thinking being in the galaxy, Zara replied. Besides, they already have access to human analytical capabilities. They have you. That's different. I'm one person working under duress. You're suggesting formal cooperation. I'm suggesting we try to understand the situation before we make choices we can't undo. She turned back to Thektar. War Commander, if we agree to this temporary cooperation, what assurances do we have regarding our status and safety? You would be classified as technical consultants under protective custody, Thektar said after a moment of consideration. Your expertise would be valued, but your movements would remain restricted. And after the analysis is complete, that would depend upon what we discover. It wasn't exactly a guarantee of safety, but it was probably the best they were going to get under the circumstances. Zara looked around the chamber one more time, taking in the thousands of storage containers holding the compressed history of nearly 100 civilizations. How long until this ship reaches the Crovaxi capital? For hours, Vekhai replied. And how long would a comprehensive analysis of the consciousness templates take? With current Crovaxi analytical capabilities, several months. With human computational assistance. Vekhai paused, clearly calculating. Perhaps weeks. We don't have weeks, Webb said. If this ship docks at your capital with the human genetic modifications still integrated into the Matrix network, and if your leadership decides to proceed with the awakening ceremony. The awakening ceremony? Zara asked. Thektar's expression became almost reverent. The Great Awakening has been planned for the next lunar cycle. When all 3 archive ships are gathered at the capital, their matrices will be linked together and the consciousness resurrection will begin. How many matrices are we talking about? Approximately 50,000 consciousness templates, accumulated over the past 1,000,000 years of conquest. The number hit Zara like a physical blow. They weren't talking about awakening a few ancient overlords. They were talking about resurrecting the equivalent of an entire civilization's worth of architect minds, all simultaneously. And with the human genetic modifications integrated into that network. Webb's voice trailed off as he contemplated the implications. We could be looking at 50,000 hybrid consciousness entities with architect-level technological capabilities and human psychological patterns, Zara finished. which could be anything from humanity's greatest triumph to the galaxy's final catastrophe. Or something entirely unexpected, Vekhi added thoughtfully. Thektar made a decision. Subcommander, you will establish a joint analysis team with these humans as technical consultants. Priority authorization level 7. I want preliminary findings before we dock at the capital. Understood, War Commander. Dr. Webb, Commander Chun, you will assist Subcommander Vekhi with complete honesty and to the best of your abilities. Any attempt at sabotage or deception will result in immediate termination. Zara nodded. Understood. But I have one request. State it. I want to see the other human genetic samples in your archives. If my command modified our crew's genetics, I need to understand the full scope of what they did. Thektar considered this for a moment. Granted. Subcommander, provide them with access to all relevant human biological data. As the security forces began to disperse, Zara found herself wondering if she had just made the best decision of her life or the worst. They were committed now to a course of action that involved cooperating with humanity's enemies to analyze technology that could reshape the galaxy's balance of power. But, as she followed Vekhi toward the deeper analysis chambers, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real game was just beginning. The analysis chambers were located several levels deeper in the ship, in areas that felt even more organic than the main archives. The walls here pulsed with visible circulatory systems, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with quantum field fluctuations. The matrices require specialized environmental conditions for detailed analysis, Vekhi explained as they walked. The consciousness templates exist partially in normal space and partially in quantum dimensions. Accessing them safely requires careful field manipulation. They entered a chamber dominated by a massive spherical device suspended in the center of the room. Tendrils of organic material connected the sphere to various control stations positioned around its perimeter, and the entire assembly hummed with barely contained energy. This is a consciousness interface matrix, Vekhi said. It allows direct mental connection with the archived consciousness templates for analysis purposes. Webb stared at the device with obvious fascination and horror. You actually interface directly with the architect minds. With portions of them, yes. Complete interface would be inadvisable. Even fragments of architect consciousness can overwhelm most biological neural systems. Most? Zara asked. Crovaxy neural architecture is uniquely adapted for interfacing with complex consciousness patterns. It is one of the reasons we were able to survive the original architect purges. Zara was beginning to understand something that chilled her to the bone. You weren't just modified by the architects to be apex predators. You were modified to be compatible with their technology. Correct. We were designed to eventually serve as interface hosts for the full architect consciousness network. The conquest of other species was simply the method by which we would accumulate the necessary genetic and cultural diversity for complete resurrection. But you believe you rebelled against them and gained your freedom. Vekhi's expression became uncertain. That is what our historical records indicate. However, recent analysis suggests that our rebellion may have been part of the original programming. Webb moved to one of the control stations and began studying the readouts. You're saying the architects wanted you to rebel against them? We are saying that the line between rebellion and programming becomes unclear when dealing with consciousness entities capable of planning across geological timescales. The implications of this revelation settled over Zara like a cold blanket. If the Crovaxy rebellion had been planned by the architects, then everything that followed, the million years of conquest, the accumulation of genetic samples, even the current situation, might all be part of some incomprehensibly vast design. Subcommander, she said carefully, when your people decided to proceed with the Great Awakening, did anyone consider the possibility that you were still following architect programming? The question has been raised in strategic council sessions. However, the consensus is that our evolutionary path has diverged sufficiently from our original parameters that we have achieved true independence. And what if that consensus is wrong? Vekhi was quiet for a moment, studying the consciousness interface device. Then, the Great Awakening will not result in Crovaxy transcendence. It will result in the completion of the architect grand design. Webb looked up from the control station he had been examining. There's something else we need to consider. If the human genetic modifications are designed to overwrite architect consciousness templates, and if those templates have been guiding Crovaxi development for 1 million years, then activating the modified consciousness could free the Crovaxi from their programming, Zara finished. Or it could replace architect control with human control. Or it could create something entirely new. A hybrid consciousness with aspects of human psychology, Crovaxi evolutionary adaptation, and architect technological capability. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the magnitude of what they were dealing with. In less than 4 hours, this ship would dock at the Crovaxi capital, where the leadership of an entire galactic empire would be preparing to activate technology that none of them truly understood. "We need to run a test," Zara said finally. "What kind of test?" Bekai asked. "A small-scale consciousness interface using human genetic data. If we can understand how the modifications interact with the matrix system on a limited scale, we might be able to predict what will happen during the full awakening." Webb nodded slowly. "It would be dangerous. Direct interface with modified consciousness templates could have unpredictable effects on whoever serves as the test subject." "I'll do it," Zara said. "Commander, you don't understand the risks. Dr. Webb, I'm a Terran Navy officer whose ship was destroyed while carrying classified genetic modifications that could affect the fate of the galaxy. Understanding those risks is exactly my job." Vekhai moved to another control station and began inputting commands. The interface can be configured for limited exposure. However, the subject would need to be physically connected to the matrix system, which involves direct neural interface. Is it reversible? In theory. However, consciousness interface technology operates on quantum levels that are not fully understood. There is always a risk of permanent psychological alteration. Zara looked at the spherical device hanging in the center of the chamber, its organic tendrils writhing slowly, as if responding to her attention. The smart choice would be to wait, to try to find some other way to analyze the modified consciousness templates without risking direct exposure. But they didn't have time for smart choices. In a few hours, the Crovaxi leadership would begin the Great Awakening ceremony, and whatever came out of that process would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy forever. "Set it up," she said. Webb grabbed her arm. "Zara, this is insane. We're talking about directly interfacing your mind with modified architect consciousness templates. You could lose yourself completely. Dr. Webb, if we don't understand what we're dealing with, we could all lose ourselves anyway. At least this way, we have a chance of gathering useful information." Vekhai had moved to a medical station and was preparing what looked like neural interface equipment. The procedure will require approximately 30 minutes for full neural mapping and interface establishment. During that time, the subject will experience direct consciousness contact with the archived templates. What will that feel like? Based on previous interfaces with unmodified templates, the subject typically experiences a flood of alien memories and thought patterns. With modified templates, the experience could be different. Different how? Unknown. This will be the first test of human-modified consciousness templates. As Vekhai began preparing the interface equipment, Zara tried to focus on what she hoped to accomplish. If the human modifications were designed to overwrite architect consciousness, she might experience something closer to human thought patterns than alien ones. If they were designed to corrupt the templates entirely, she might experience nothing but chaos. Or she might experience something completely unexpected. "Commander," Webb said quietly, "if this goes wrong, if the interface process damages your mind, I want you to know that working with you these past few days has reminded me why I became a scientist in the first place." Zara smiled. "Dr. Webb, if this goes wrong, the state of my mind will be the least of our problems." She moved toward the consciousness interface matrix, trying to ignore the way its organic components seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Whatever happened in the next 30 minutes would determine not just their immediate survival, but the fate of every thinking being in the galaxy. Beginning neural interface in 60 seconds, Vekhai announced. Zara took a deep breath and prepared to dive into the deepest mysteries of consciousness itself, carrying with her the hopes and fears of two species who had spent years as enemies and might now be the galaxy's only hope for avoiding catastrophe. The interface tendrils reached for her, and she reached back.